All right. Welcome. Really thrilled to have everyone here with us today for another installment of our Preservation Month activities that have been going on. It's been a great month, and thrilled that many of you on the call have been able to join us for numerous events. And also want to give a big thanks and shout out to our sponsors. And if you're not familiar, on our website, we have a page listing all of our Preservation Month activities and an incredible roster of local businesses that support the Preservation Society and support Charleston. And we absolutely encourage you to support these local businesses as well. But we're thrilled to have everyone with us today. As we said, this is really an interactive opportunity that we want to engage with our membership and talk about one of the most pressing issues that we have in the city of Charleston. This will be interactive. We encourage you to please add any questions or thoughts you have to the chat. We'll try to pull those together and have some time at the end to discuss those. We're also going to be polling the audience on a few occasions and ask that you please think and respond as accurately as possible. Really helpful to the entire team. I want to introduce the team. I'm Christopher King, Executive Director, and joining us today on this conversation is the incredibly talented advocacy and preservation team from the Preservation Society. We've got Brian Turner, who is our Director of Advocacy, Aaron Minigan, our Director of Historic Preservation, and Anna Catherine Carroll, our Manager of Preservation Initiatives. This team attends hundreds of meetings a year and sits through even more meetings with architects, developers, property owners, neighbors, neighborhood associations. It's an incredibly busy role that this team fulfills. And so we're thrilled to talk about something that we're passionate about, which is how do we continue to make Charleston retain its incredible, unique character and quality of life. As we all know, we're going through an unprecedented rate of change. Not only on the peninsula, but throughout the entire region. We're seeing this a lot in particularly the historically rural communities. And this unprecedented pressure we're building in low-lying areas. We've seen a lot of that come to light in the recent conversations around flooding. We're thrilled that the city plan is going to sort of tackle this directly head on. But we're also seeing a lot of pressure on African-American settlement communities, historic cemeteries and burial grounds. And these issues are keeping us incredibly busy as well. But the bottom line is these market forces, they're here. Charleston's changing as a result. And I think that's not going to change. And so we have to determine how do we do this in the best way possible for Charleston. There are massive opportunities for a community going through the level of growth that Charleston is. But I think our question is are we taking advantage of it? And so we're excited to talk through a number of this today. But, if one picks up the paper, we see that there's a shortage of affordable housing. We're not enhancing the urban realm sufficiently with these new buildings. We're not creating good green space or public space to go along with a lot of these densities that are coming. So there's a lot of opportunity that needs to be brought more into this conversation. And that's a larger conversation than just design. But this is where we are. This is where we're working every single day and really want to acknowledge Brian, Aaron, and Anna Catherine for really doing the groundwork and the hard work every day for the city of Charleston and this entire Low Country region. We've been here for 100 years and we've got, I think, pretty good perspective. We helped create the BAR and I don't want to say we've been at every single meeting, but pretty darn close to it. And it's interesting to look back that, really preservation grew out of one of the most disruptive events that happened in urban cities around the world, which was the introduction of the car and things like gas stations to service the car. Well, the car is still one of the major challenges that we're addressing today. And you're going to see that really directly in a number of the new buildings that we're talking about. So we're thrilled that you can join us. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to Brian Turner.
Thank you, Christopher. So why are we talking about big new buildings in Charleston? Well, the concern we have, and we're hearing over and over again, is that the city is getting a blocky, bland new look. And we have to ask, is it just a foregone conclusion that our generation is going to be defined by sort of forgettable architecture, and a lot of it driven by the need to house personal vehicles? The webinar is designed to take a step back and consider the trend in the bigger picture, and to find out what tools are at our disposal that help us shape the look and the feel of the city. What this is not is a debate about the value of big buildings. Like them or not, large-scale buildings are going to be a defining feature of the 21st century skyline in Charleston. But what we will be suggesting is that the impact on the city's architectural character and its livability is under our control. We don't want to depress you here with all these photos of large, blocky architecture. We'd prefer to inspire you with what you can do about it. And through the lens of a few projects, we'll describe points of leverage for the public in the project entitlement process, where we have the power to shape the direction of development. And if decision makers aren't listening, we can always hold them accountable for their actions in the democratic process. So when we're asked questions like how and when did this get approved, there's likely a long backstory. As you'll see, the land use entitlement process is complex. And we think it's necessarily complex in Charleston. There should be thoughtfulness to build in such a unique and precious place as Charleston. So our aim here is to demystify that process and work collectively with you, members and supporters, to get better outcomes. I'm going to give a brief overview of our presentation. First, we'll describe the Preservation Society's vision for the future of Charleston and the values that we see as most important as we engage in the process as advocates. Second, through a detailed look at the Courier Square project on Upper King Street, we'll provide an overview of how big buildings are reviewed and approved by city agencies. And last, we're going to describe several projects where public input on major projects has made a positive impact, and showcase how your participation can help us make positive change. So use the chat box as you see fit, and we'd like to get to questions and answers at the end. But with that, I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Erin Minigan and Anna Catherine Carroll, to kick it off.
Thanks. So building on Brian's point, we want to convey our overarching vision for Charleston, how we approach projects like this through a preservation lens, and the core issues involved. In Charleston and cities across the US, density is a contentious term. Density has become synonymous with negative things like congestion, traffic, and out-of-scale buildings. But Charleston is historically a dense city. Population-wise, the peninsula is less dense than it has ever been. In a city like Charleston, it's easy to conflate big buildings with tourism-related congestion. But density is an important part of the equation going forward as we seek to address the affordability crisis. The question is where it is located and what it looks like. In advocating for best outcomes for new development in Charleston, we support the following. First, manage change of our unique urban environment by maintaining high standards for new buildings. We seek to highlight good examples of new construction projects and positive infill in historic contexts every year through the Carolopoulos Award for New Construction. Additionally, we advocate for the highest quality design, materials, and details through our advocacy in the design review process on a weekly basis at Board of Architectural Review meetings. We also support density where appropriate to take pressure off rural, low-lying land. We've continually seen our outlying flood-prone areas like Johns Island overdeveloped and subject to insensitive suburban development. That's why we feel it's important to support density where it makes sense, on high ground with access to transit, resources, services, etc. The Dutch dialogues recommended establishing elevation-based land use policy to limit dense development on low-lying areas and better utilize underdeveloped land, including forests and marshland, to protect against flooding. Meanwhile, the Upper Peninsula has rightly become a target for density as a formerly underdeveloped industrial part of the city. The PSC has supported denser but appropriately scaled development in this area through our work on the Upper Peninsula Initiative, which resulted in creative zoning that rewards investment in community benefits like affordable housing and contributions to the public realm.
So in this vein, with appropriately located density does come the opportunity to introduce affordable housing throughout the city. And housing affordability is a hot topic right now in the city, and it's critical to ensuring a sustainable future for Charleston, because as we know, a city does lose its vibrancy when its longtime citizens are displaced. So through our advocacy, we seek to advance policies that not only ensure that existing housing stock is maintained, but that new development contributes to the availability of affordable units throughout the city, which we will cover in more detail later on in the presentation. And finally, we also support high quality public space to promote Charleston as a city of good neighborhoods. With increased density and new development should also come a greater network of public spaces to create livable, walkable, multimodal communities. And through our advocacy, we really do strive to push city leadership to make providing better public spaces a top priority citywide. High quality, publicly accessible open space is necessary for the success of a city and is a shared responsibility requiring municipalities and the private sector to work together to create places like we're seeing here.
So to ensure we see development and design that reflects what is unique about this city, we need strong policy, good public process, and rigorous enforcement of these standards. Charleston needs a clear vision supported by everyday decision-making through consistent application of our city's planning documents and ordinances. It is critical to understand how important zoning is to this conversation. While the scale of development we are seeing on streets like Meeting and Morrison seem jarring, the height and size of these buildings are ultimately facilitated by what our city's zoning allows. Here's an image depicting the city's height districts, meticulously studied and redrawn about 5 years ago. The areas in purple show the central spine of the peninsula where the greatest height is allowed, up to 8 stories. Not only is this the historic high ground, but the city's primary commercial corridors. This approach to height is also in keeping with the traditional building patterns in Charleston, with the tallest buildings along the central thoroughfares tapering down toward the water. But it's important to note that our zoning ordinance empowers the Board of Architectural Review to shape new development to better relate to its context. This image illustrates how some developers interpret their entitlements by right. However, our local ordinances uphold the board's authority to regulate height, scale, mass, and architecture of buildings in order to, according to the ordinance, promote the economic and general welfare of the city and the public, and to ensure harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth and development of the city. That being said, with every new building, the landscape of our city is changed. Today, we will show you several big building examples that demonstrate how important it is to engage early in the process, to make buildings as good as they can be within the realm of what zoning allows, to ensure new development fits sensitively within Charleston's historic built environment and meets the community's needs.
All right, so with that, we'd like to get a little bit of information and wake you all up out there. And we're going to do a couple polls and then get into the second part of our presentation and talk about one particular project. So the first question is, how often do you engage in the public process? Anywhere from weekly to never. And we'll wait 30 seconds. Great. Looks like we have a nice range, but in general, 1 to 2, about a third of you, 3 to 4 times a third. Good. Well, thank you. And so this helps us tailor our presentation a little bit. The second question is, how important of an issue do you think the construction of big buildings is for preservation in Charleston? Okay, so this is not surprising because you all have tuned in to listen to this webinar, but this is a critical issue, and it is germane to what we do as we described, and so I'm glad to see lots of people agree. Feel free to put in the chat on the first question, by the way, other things you think, ways that the public process we could better explain and demystify better for the public, because it can also often be a challenge. Okay, so we're going to transition to the second part of the presentation now and review a major building project to provide a lens for what it takes to get the land use entitlements for a big building in Charleston. Take it away, Anna Catherine.
Great. Yes, so we're going to start off with a project that the Preservation Society was highly involved in several years ago. If you've been following along with us for any amount of time, you may have received advocacy alerts and updates from us on this project, but it's also one that most people are familiar with just from driving north and south on the peninsula. And this is a large-scale project situated within a densely developed historic streetscape called Courier Square. And Courier Square is a major mixed-use, multi-phase, 12-acre development located on the Upper King and Meeting Street corridors between Spring and Line Streets. And Courier Square Phase 1, which is what we can see here, was completed back in 2018 and includes a 226-unit apartment building on Columbus Street and an office building that fronts Meeting Street. So to entitle major projects like this, the first step is typically to go to Planning Commission for rezoning requests, typically for use and often for height. And it's important to understand that a request to rezone at the Planning Commission, what this is a request to alter the city's zoning map and fundamentally change the land use for the site in question, which is what we're seeing here is the previous zoning map for Courier Square. The Planning Commission reviews items such as rezoning requests and ordinance amendments, and it's required to consider impacts on community character as well as compatibility within the city's comprehensive plan and other land use policies and documents. And the commission, they're tasked to make informed recommendations that are ultimately sent to City Council, where the decisions are made by our elected officials. But it's important to note that this is the part of the process where we really see the least engagement, because looking at this image right here, this is hard to understand. It's very typical. It can be difficult to visualize the potential impacts of a project in question by just looking at a map like this. At this point, we don't have fully developed plans or renderings. But the reality is that a change in the zoning map is the most important and impactful decision in the process. And at this point, we can see things like unit counts, traffic impacts, and the overall function of a building change dramatically. And for major residential projects like Courier Square and many other throughout the city, here we're looking at West Edge, one of the most common rezoning requests that we see is a change in use to mixed use workforce housing, or MU zoning. And so we wanted to take just a moment at this point in the presentation to kind of take a step back and talk about what MU zoning is, because this particular zoning category is having major impacts on development and affordability in our city at this very moment. You may have seen that articulated in our communications lately. It's a big topic of conversation. So in theory, MU zoning allows a project to achieve increased density or unit count in exchange for the construction of workforce housing mixed in with market rate units. However, there is an option to pay a fee in lieu of building the workforce units, which ultimately goes into the city's affordable housing fund to construct affordable units elsewhere in the city. And this is the avenue that most developers pursue. And in fact, 13 of 14 projects that have been rezoned to MU in recent years have opted to pay the fee in lieu instead of actually incorporating workforce units in their projects. So as a result, far fewer units are actually getting built where they're most desperately needed, and affordable housing has become an intended benefit that we aren't really seeing when parcels are rezoned mixed use workforce housing. So this really underscores the far-reaching impacts of rezoning requests, their significance, and why we really urge our membership in the community to engage with us early in the process. So Courier Square is just one example of a project, a major large-scale residential project that has actually opted to pay the fee in lieu of building workforce units back when it was rezoned in 2014. And that was included on the map that we recently saw, but a very common occurrence across developments in the city.
Yeah, so after Planning Commission and City Council, a project will enter the design review phase with the Board of Architectural Review, or the BAR. Within the boundaries of the city's historic districts, the BAR reviews all exterior work visible from any public right-of-way, including new construction, alterations, or renovations, as well as requests for demolition. In 2016, the BAR was split into two boards, the BAR Large and the BAR Small. The BAR Large hears requests for buildings greater than 10,000 square feet, and the BAR Small hears requests for those less than 10,000 square feet. We see more engagement at the BAR than through the rezoning process, given that renderings and other visuals developed by the stage allow the community to more easily understand the impact of the building being proposed. When it came to Courier Square, the PSC was highly involved in the design review of this majorly impactful project at the BAR, which has really set the tone for subsequent development in this area. Feedback on phase one is that people generally don't love the office building. However, we have heard far less objection to the apartment portion, which we find really interesting. So what is the difference between these two components of the building? The office portion is much more grand in its architectural expression, but with a lower quality material palette, primarily consisting of stucco. Meanwhile, the apartment building is well detailed, but with simpler materials, in keeping with the character of the area. A building's relationship to its context is crucial to its success. As mentioned, this is a multi-phase project, and just earlier this year, the development of Courier Square Phase 2 was similarly initiated with rezoning requests for use and additional height before the Planning Commission and City Council. This part of the project is located on the west side of King Street between Line, Spring, and St. Philip Streets. Before the project reached its first public meeting, the PSC worked closely with the adjacent neighborhood and project team to weigh the impacts of the requests. Because of the project's close proximity to the largely 2- and 3-story Cannonboro-Elliottboro neighborhood, the PSC opposed the request to rezone the site from 6 to 7 stories. Additionally, the PSC pushed for this development to incorporate workforce housing units and forego short-term rental uses to help address the lack of long-term affordable housing downtown. As a result of our collaboration with the neighborhood and project team, an agreement was reached that restricts short-term rental uses, late-night activity, and ensures the inclusion of affordable housing on site. We hope this illustrates why engaging early matters when key aspects of a project are locked in place that will have major impacts on the community.
I want to stop here to just sort of recognize Courier Square in its context. It's just one of many developments that's been proposed in this kind of Upper King Street area. And really, once this is all built out, this is going to be the single densest space in the state of South Carolina. It's also the southern terminus of a project many of you are likely familiar with called the Low Line, which would terminate at Wolf Street and extend to Mount Pleasant in this conceptual rendering. It's in a former railroad corridor, and it's a public green space that's often shown in projects that are seeking entitlements in this area. And clearly, it's much needed green space that would add tremendous value to the developments. But the question has come up frequently in the last several years as to, will this become a reality? And if so, who will pay for it? The nonprofit Friends of the Low Line is estimating the project may exceed $60 million. And it's important to recognize that the burden of providing the funding at this point is slated to fall on the public and philanthropic sectors. Under current policy, none of that funding is required to come from these residential developments that would benefit the most from it. We see that this lack of initiative to require funding for green space and other public amenities like the low line in exchange for newer and denser developments is a huge missed opportunity for the city. Parks and green space will be essential, especially in these dense environments, to create livable environments. And we intend to keep pushing the city to demand more from developers who have the capacity to contribute for these types of public amenities. On that note, we're going to do another poll for those who are familiar with Upper Meeting and King Street. As they continue to develop, what is your top priority? Affordable housing, public transit, architecture, or public green space? And you can elect just one. Great. Okay, it looks like we have a range here, which is good. It looks like we chose wisely, and all of these things are concerned. Architecture really bubbles up to the top, and public greens. Oh, actually, public green space. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And we're gonna move on in the presentation now to the last part to provide a bit of inspiration for you all and feature a few projects where public input has been effective at shaping projects for the better.
So we really want your takeaway from all of this not to be that our city's changing and there's nothing you can do about it, but that you do have multiple chances to make your voice heard as big buildings are being reviewed. And the public's input really does impact the decisions that our boards and commissions and councils make every day. So next, we will walk through a few examples just actually from the past year where the public's input has positively influenced the decision-making process in its volume and in its quality. Just a couple of projects where we just saw an outpouring of community input and just the effect that that has made in the process. So we'll start with 194 Cannon Street, which many of you may be familiar with. 194 Cannon Street is a 175 unit hotel that's situated between the Cannon and Spring Street, part of the connector at the base of the Ashley River Bridge. In 2017, the property was actually rezoned to allow for up to 11 stories and an accommodations use. And in June of 2020, so just last year, the proposed Aloft Hotel was brought forward for BAR review. And this was actually the first major project to be reviewed upon the introduction of virtual public meetings during the COVID-19 stay-at-home times. And in addition to serious concern with the project's corporate architectural direction, material palette, its uninviting presence, we were very concerned that challenges to virtual public engagement would allow for this project to slip through the review process under the radar. So in typical fashion, we put out a call to our members to ensure that the community had the adequate information to engage on this project. And we were so pleased that the response was incredibly encouraging, that we were able to see more members and residents in the community participate in this particular project review than we had seen on just about any other project up until this point. And the board unanimously denied the project in response to the outpouring of opposition that the community showed. And this project continued through the design review process throughout the summer into the fall. It's actually still ongoing, and it's dramatically improved. So here are just a couple of examples of how this project has progressed and been refined to better relate to Charleston, which is always the goal and the desired outcome through the design review process. And this really illustrates the importance of community input and a collaborative, informed design review process.
Yeah, and I would just add that that's a great situation where the design team really rolled up their sleeves in response and really came back and worked with us and all the stakeholders to really work on what we feel is a far more appropriate and more successful outcome. Next, we want to talk about a project that we've talked about a fair bit recently that many of you are probably familiar with, which is a proposal for 295 Calhoun Street. This is a property that was, when all the heights were being redone, where it was actually not included in the redistricting because it was a medical university property, and there's a different sort of approach to handling heights in that district for somewhat obvious reasons, as it's quite different than the rest of the city. But this came through and was also rezoned to a 6-story district. And so ultimately, that was sort of fairly consistent with the zoning that they had. But the proposal comes back to the BAR at this point, and the developers in this situation are seeking architectural merit as well. And so what we're looking at here with this building is really a project that is driven by a couple of fundamentals. Number one, cars. This is a project that's parking in a 5 or 6-story parking deck. I believe the number is around 400 cars. And so it has this approach of basically 400 residents. We need to have 400 cars. And then we wrap this parking garage in a building. We met early with the development team and the architecture firm, which is not a local firm that hasn't worked with the BAR and our processes before. And we strongly encouraged them that this was problematic. We were really supported in that by the Charleston Village Neighborhood Association, Historic Charleston Foundation, and other groups. But they decided to really press on and as is their right, really wanted to hear from the BAR on whether or not this direction was one that they should proceed with. You know, one of the core challenges is they wanted to create some waterfront enhancements. I will say the building comes right up to the property line, so they're actually building docks over Alberta Long Lake, but they would propose a ring around it, walkway. We actually felt that the building responded better to Alberta Long Lake than it did to Calhoun Street. And being a major entry point, we think it's critical that there's success in addressing Calhoun Street, which has long been an area of focus for the city planning department and city leaders about how we create an architecture that is representative of what might be considered one of our more grand boulevards in theory. So we met with the team, they pressed on and went to the BAR. There was an incredible outpouring of community opposition. We think after the Sergeant Jasper, this project maybe had the largest public engagement. And there were over 80 comments submitted in opposition. And so this was resoundingly denied by the BAR. You know, one of the things that we talked about with the firm is they put up a photograph of the People's Building and said, well, this is our, you know, nod to the People's Building. But there are a couple of core differences. And one is most important, which is materiality. You know, when you look at an historic building, they're fairly rational, they're simple, they use good traditional materials. And obviously the building codes and the requirements are very, very different today. But these large buildings are a formula. It's what can be financed, it's how they can stack the units, how they can double load a corridor, they can fit the parking in. So this is what's pushing these boxes to be so big. But what we're also seeing is every one of these projects goes for architectural merit. Now, as y'all can recall, we went through this whole redesign of our BAR 5 years ago, and architectural merit is a provision that was really put in there as an incentive to encourage better materials, better treatment of the ground floor space, that urban realm engagement. But ultimately, it's become, in essence, a sort of by right approach for the developers. So when we redid all these height districts, what we see is everyone rezones up a height and then goes for architectural merit. So we're constantly opposing and fighting buildings that are 2 stories taller than what was really envisioned with the Duane study, where we spent months studying each block of the city and discussing appropriate heights. So we feel like we're on our heels, and I think it puts city staff and the community in a really tough position of having to define what is architectural merit. And we work with a lot of architects. And, you know, I think most architects would think that their work is meritorious and of high quality. So it's an undefined, vague, and we would say flawed aspect of the ordinance, because this building is taller than it is allowed under zoning. We do not think that architectural merit is met in this building. but we see this come up on every single project, and the idea is about making buildings better. It's not about just giving more. The MU district that we mentioned allows most of these properties to go from tens of units an acre to unlimited. So there's already massive entitlements that are being afforded to the developer. And the hope through this conversation and through this process is, how do we get better outcomes? How do we get architecture that is better for the community? Because the developer is getting a tremendous amount of density. That's what's making all of these big buildings go. But at the end of the day, is the community getting the architecture and the quality that it deserves, that's commensurate to what's being given to the developers?
Thanks. So we'll move on here. And so in addition to giving you the tools to engage and informing the community to be able to participate in the public process, we also want to highlight that the PSC stands with the community, and we're there when you can't be. This is particularly illustrated in this next example, which is a recent advocacy success focused on a request for additional heights, similar to the last example at 295 Calhoun Street, where an additional floor was being requested for architectural merit and context. But this one is in a particularly sensitive area of the King Street corridor. This is 363 to 369 King Street, which is a proposed student housing project located just south of Calhoun Street and set back only 50 feet from King Street. The project came to the BAR Large in December of this past year and requested an additional 7th-story penthouse in a 6-story height district on the basis of architectural merit. The PSC was incredibly concerned about the potential adverse impacts of the proposed height and mass on Lower King Street, as the building would be highly visible from Marion Square over the 2- and 3-story buildings along King Street. The PSC put emphasis on the fact that this additional height for architectural merit and context is the most significant request that can be made of the BAR, as just explained by Chris. And that the threshold for approval should be maintained at a very high standard. We called on the board to deny this request for additional height, given the visibility and impact of the proposed 7th floor, and even went a step further in asking that the board consider exercising its authority to reduce the building's height by a 1/2 story, something that up until this point had never been done before. We were incredibly encouraged that the BAR agreed with our recommendation and not only denied the request for additional height, but required a 1/2 story reduction to 5.5 stories. The applicant responded appropriately and returned with a much more sensitive proposal, serving as an excellent example of how a project can progress positively through the process. That's why we maintain a consistent professional presence at all levels of the public process, working closely with project teams, city staff, and elected officials. We'll take wins where we can get them. It's hard to see incremental changes, but when you look at these over time, these small decisions make a big difference. For example, here's the Armada Hoffler building, the apartment building at the corner of King and Spring Streets, which went through several incremental changes through the design process and ended up in a much better place from where it started.
So we're gonna move towards conclusion here, but in wrapping up, I wanted to offer a few thoughts and context and point to a few projects on the horizon that are very big picture and that you can expect to hear more about. Charleston overall is well recognized nationally and even globally as a pioneer in its use of zoning authority to shape the look and the feel of the built environment and to manage change. The preservation victories we've achieved over the years as a community really add up, and it's honestly a defining element of the city's culture that Charleston has an ethic of stewardship. But in this respect, in today's age, the market demand for large-scale development truly is a new era for preservationists and challenges us in new ways. And our approach to this issue today will determine how the city will look and feel for generations. It challenges us to think more broadly about what it means to be a preservationist, frankly, and challenges us to better understand the tools of real estate development. So in wrapping up, I just want to point to a few big picture projects on the horizon. We couldn't do this webinar without acknowledging that the city plan is in motion, the 10-year document that will guide Charleston's future for the next 10 years. And we expect to see a draft in the coming weeks. We've issued some comments on recommendations that we've seen the city have put out. The big change that we can all expect is that the planning department will be promoting major zoning reform as described as elevation-based zoning to locate and concentrate development on higher lands. And it's that type of zoning code overhaul is something we very much welcome. But we also want to make sure that in doing that, that the ethic of preservation and stewardship isn't lost. And we do think that the city can improve pretty dramatically on where they, on the draft recommendations they provide on cultural resources. So the next step in that process is a special planning commission, which we understand to be May 26th. And you can always watch out for our emails and visit our website to stay up to date on that process. I think they're aiming for council approval in July. Second, we wanted to mention, think that the Preservation Society is really thinking proactively about reforms to the BAR process. You heard from Chris about some of the troubling ways that applicants are seeking architectural merit to earn additional height. But there's other policies we're concerned with as well, and the implementation of the BAR's discretion. So we will be evaluating ways and suggestions to have BAR have better and more predictable processes for applicants. And third, I wanted to mention the idea of preservation and livability. What I think we really started out as a movement is preserving old houses and old dwellings, and we had remarkable success. And Charleston is testament to that. But if we don't focus on promoting viable, functioning communities for all economic classes, we've missed the ball. But livability has to be the focus of our movement if we are to remain relevant, and will be a key lens for us as we evaluate projects moving forward. And lastly, we wanted to note that the buzz happening around the prospective redevelopment of this 63-acre property known as Union Pier. This is an enormous opportunity. It's likely to be one of the single most impactful projects in Charleston's history. The State Ports Authority sold the land last year. We know the entitlement process is underway, although we have very few further details about what will be proposed for the site. So you can imagine the stakes are incredibly high for this piece of land. It's a major opportunity for the city to cast a vision for resilient design solutions and something that contributes meaningfully to the city's urban landscape. It's notably lacking thus far in drafts of the city plan, which seems to be a major omission. But our goal will be to work to make sure this opportunity isn't missed.
Brian, just to clarify that the property did not sell. The Ports Authority is contracted with a local developer to engage in the entitlement of the property, which we anticipate taking anywhere from 12 to 24 months. But you can rest assured that we will be fighting for a robust public process for that project.
Thank you for the clarification. So in closing, we just want to give a nod to the importance of our membership. We have a far greater impact when we can represent the views of the community that stood with us for over 100 years. There's not a lot holding the line against rampant growth without community benefit. And we really deeply appreciate your support and encourage you to stay tuned to our calls to action and help us keep an ear to the ground on important issues as they bubble up in Charleston. We're all available to you all. And with that, I'd love to open it up for some Q&A. So please use the chat box. I know we have some discussion going on there. Right.
So let's see, I can read one of the first questions is how can an individual who doesn't live in the city, so can't vote, make a difference in some of these outcomes? And I'm happy to sort of jump in and talk on that one quickly. You know, all of this regulatory framework that we're talking about exists at the will of local leadership. So our BAR, our planning commission, our city plan, these are all created and approved and ultimately stewarded by our city leaders. So, you know, as far as engaging in projects, you know, traditionally, you know, one needs to be a resident in the city to speak on issues. But the reality is with the dawn of Zoom, it's almost impossible for the city to sort of manage that. So there are lots of folks that can weigh in, but even letters of support. But I also think one of the most important things is that's what you have organizations like the Preservation Society for. And we would encourage you to reach out to our staff, to work with our staff, and also encourage you to encourage all of your friends who love Charleston and who live here to join and be a part of this movement, because it is all about strength in numbers. Let's see, who wants to take the next question?
Not sure if we've received other questions yet.
Well, we've got a comment here that's talking about the Courier Square project. That's actually a very good point. So the Courier Square project that we mentioned, there is this stuccoed office building and then the brick apartment building. One of the great concerns that we've heard with the office building is not the design. And I think when you saw the renderings, it was a project that everyone felt was very positive and was excited about. So the BAR and the design, that's just one piece of it. But once a design is set, it's about the execution and the materials. Our building codes really limit what we can do. Stucco on a 200-year-old house is very different from stucco on a brand new building. And so these new buildings have what are called control joints. It's those little lines that you see all over the building. And so arguably the biggest criticism that we hear of that building is not of the design, but it's of the execution of the materials, because there are lines all over it. So when we take traditional details that we see all around Charleston, like window sills and lintels and headers and string courses, details and pilasters and columns, you know, there is a sense of weight that we all sort of intuitively understand just because we see it. And so when it's replicated on a new building and that weight and that detail isn't to the same quality, it actually stands in stark contrast to the historic buildings. So that's one of the reasons why, and there were some photographs, you know, we work with city staff and go out and review what are called sample panels. So they'll build a mock-up of the materials and work through that as they're going through the process. And it's just so important. And I do have to give a shout out to city staff, because it is a small group that is managing every single project from a small addition on a house in any neighborhood to these massive buildings. And there's so much work going on that their task is enormous. And so, you know, we really see ourselves as partners to them, and they do a tremendous job with the limited resources that they have. And back to our question earlier about what can one do? Well, we all need to lobby city council to provide more resources to the planning department, because we need more planners, we need more architects, we need more enforcement officers. The need goes on, and that's only going to happen as if our leadership hears loudly from the community that this is a major priority.
We've seen a couple more questions come in. I'll pose this one. For Union Pier, can we indicate any of the preferences the Preservation Society would have for the property, and what level of influence we could possibly have on it?
Well, I think there's plenty of possibility on the input. We're actually engaged with the Ports Authority and with Lowe, which is the property the group that's working on the entitlements. And we're trying to engage early. Ultimately, what we see there is really an extension of the historic city. But it's not just a design conversation. Honestly, it's probably more about use. How do we get an appropriate, diverse mix of use? Housing is critical. There might be an accommodations element, but what we don't want to see are single-use districts. If it becomes a district that's just catered for people who spend less than 48 hours in Charleston, it's going to be a massive failure for Charleston and could irreparably damage the character and livability of downtown. So it's about getting that balance of mixes in there. So a lot of it's predicated on the underlying economics of it, but we understand that this is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the East Coast. And so the expectation for excellence is absolutely required on this. So we are working with them. We want to see waterfront access. We want to see meaningful green space. We want to see this actually be a piece of dual infrastructure so that it could also be a great living, working part of the city and a great place to visit, but it could also actually help create net gains on our stormwater challenges. There's no reason why we can't use this, because how many areas downtown where we have 60 plus acres to actually put in infrastructure to help improve the situation. So this is going to be incredibly complicated, and it complicates even further when you consider that there are currently cruise ships docking there, and what is their role going to be on it? As you all know, we've been in litigation on this for almost 15 years because we don't think that 3,000 and 4,000 passenger cruise ships are appropriate for downtown Charleston. So that's going to be a critical part of this question as well. But stay tuned. There will be lots of discussion on that issue.
Okay, I see another one here, and I think we could certainly point to some of the projects we covered in this presentation, but the question is there any, what do you see as the highest priority for public involvement in the next few months?
Yeah, I would definitely say that, one of the very first things that comes to mind is the city plan public involvement that's going to be ongoing in the next couple of months. This is, if you haven't weighed in yet, this is the time, because as Brian mentioned, what we're going to be seeing in the next couple of weeks is the first full draft of our city's comprehensive plan for the next 10 years. So we will absolutely be putting communications out on that, but it'll be important to look at each of the elements in that plan, in the draft plan, especially the ones that are most pertinent to your neighborhood, to your particular interests, and to offer feedback to the city through the public hearings that will be held over the next couple of months. This is a really important public engagement opportunity. And then project-wise, would encourage you to follow along with us and via our communication, social media, our website. We are posting the Board of Architectural Review and other review agendas weekly, and we'll put out.
I would just add, there's also one major project working through a fairly obscure process right now, which is, as y'all will call, Laurel Island. That development was approved by City Council a while back. Well, they are coming forward with their development agreement and infrastructure agreement. This is where the details get codified between the developer. Thanks to some successful advocacy, we were able to get the ability to build up to 11,000 apartment units on that property, reduced down to about 7,000. We're really pushing for, again, a diverse, healthy mix of use. But that development agreement should be going to council in the next month or month and a half. And that's something that we'll keep everyone engaged on. But again, these are massive projects, and people might think, well, Laurel Island, it's the old, trash dump, it's north of the bridge. But how these projects function and the traffic that they bring in, if they're not self-sustaining, are going to have a massive impact on the entire peninsula. So that would be another project that we would urge y'all to pay attention to as it navigates forward.
Mm-hmm.
Just also jump in and mention the seawall project. One thing we didn't talk about, we talked mostly about local land use entitlements. There's also federal and state processes. And in the case of the seawall, there's a major federal action being proposed. The Army Corps has purview. So we're anticipating an environmental impact statement to be released later this summer. And there'll be associated public comment opportunities for people to weigh in on just how this potentially highly impactful project should proceed. So we'll keep everybody updated there.
And last thing I'll add is in the very near future, we're going to be seeing some major developments proposed in that area of the Courier Square Phase 2 project on that block between King and St. Philip line and Spring Streets, some major large scale buildings being proposed on that block.
It's a question I wonder why they asked it, because this is a great example. There is so much going on, and this team is doing a tremendous job keeping up with it. But I'll do rapid fire on a couple of these remaining questions. Are they listening to you? I think that was as we were talking about Union Pier. We've developed a strong working relationship with Lowe, as they were the developers of the Cooper Hotel next door. And so, we've been working for years to develop strong relationships. And that's critical to our work. That was the team mentioned earlier. We disagree with a lot of developers and designs, but it's critically important that we have a strong working relationship because we know they'll be back with other projects. So we do feel like we have the groundwork in place for that project. As far as the State Ports Authority, we're not sure they listen to anyone, but we'll be loud and do our best on that. I'll also, are we involved in the planned Magnolia development? We worked for years on that project. So much like Laurel Island, we worked on the creation of the PUD and the development agreement. Unfortunately, as the market has moved and changed over the years, they've gone back for multiple revisions to that PUD that City Council has approved. We have worked with them on it. We are hopeful that that's still going to be a very positive project. But again, as we create these generational type projects that take decades to build out, markets move and shift. And so that's why it's so important to get the details on something like Laurel Island and Union Pier correct, because ultimately the decisions made today will drive decisions that are happening 10 and 20 years from now. And then lastly, I see, are there any big projects in the West Ashley area? Well, obviously the former mall site, which is now called the Epic Center, is the single largest development proposal for that area. That PUD and development agreement was approved by City Council about a year ago. We haven't seen any specific plans come forward for any specific large new construction. I know there are some small moves being done on the site, but that will be an important one to keep an eye on as well.
All right, well, we are getting close to 11:30 here. If there are any last minute questions, but I think we've gotten to most all of them, most in the chat. There are a few.
Well, I'll just want to appreciate everyone for attending. As you can tell, the team gets incredibly passionate about our work, and that's a key thing that makes us who we are. And we love coming to work every day because we love this community. And these are the conversations that ultimately we hope people 100 years from now can look back and say, thanks to the Preservation Society, thanks to an engaged community, Charleston is the same quality place that we inherited. So a massive shout out to Brian, Aaron, and Anna Catherine. The amount of work that this team covers is just awesome. And I hope everyone has gotten a little taste of that today. But obviously want to thank all of our members and supporters, because we can't do any of this without you, from our sponsors to members showing up at meetings. We are incredibly fortunate, and you can rest assured that as soon as we get off this, we're going back to work on these projects. And so thank you all very much for joining us. And Brian, anything to send us off with?
Well, I just want to, again, encourage everybody to, if you haven't renewed your membership, please do. We rely on you, and we appreciate you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Have a great day.